What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Makai back in the building, you feel me? Now, today, we got a recommended video. It's called The Truth About 90s Defense in the NBA and Why It Is Easier to Score in Today's League. Whew, that is a long title. Before we get into it, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the videos that I'm making. And let's go ahead and get into the video, man.
What's up, YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I'm back with another video. Over the past couple years, there have been a handful of people in the NBA community who are willing and able to go back and really challenge their perception of what we deem to be great basketball. And quite frankly, I welcome those people with open arms. But when you have people who are attempting to challenge perceptions that have been set in stone for several years now, the one big problem that consistently becomes a reoccurring theme is misinformation.
I agree to that. Shout out to Low, because I actually enjoy Low's videos and stuff. He's probably gonna bring us some numbers because he's a numbers guy. I'm not really a numbers guy. I'm more of a I can pull up facts. Like, we can pull up the numbers and we can really do that, but I'm not gonna have numbers just stacked in. I'm more of the eye test type of thing, you know what I mean? But yeah, that's one thing. Like, there's a lot of things that was said about back then that's just completely not true at all. The first thing that comes to mind is Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game. I wholeheartedly believe that game did not happen. And I believe that a lot of the viewers, a lot of you guys that are watching my videos didn't even grow up to even watch Wilt Chamberlain play. And if you did, that's incredible. But I still don't believe that Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points. I don't think that game happened. And that's a whole video for another day, but let's go ahead and get into it.
Information that unfortunately is trickled down and passed through a community that may not be willing enough nor able to actually go out of their way to be properly informed. And that's what I want to talk about in today's video. 2 to 3 weeks ago, Jimmy High Roller uploaded a video challenging the idea that 80s and 90s basketball, especially on the defensive end, was nowhere near as difficult as many ex-players and older people try to make it out to be. Now, let me be very clear on what I'm about to say. I support Jimmy High Roller, subscribe to his channel, hit the notification bell and everything, and watching that video from start to finish, I can tell you right now, there is a lot of misinformation in that video. And unfortunately, I don't believe Jimmy High Roller thoroughly understands how bad of a job he did of conveying the message that he was attempting to convey in that video. And unfortunately, because of that video and due to it touching literally over 1 million people, there have been a lot of people who have consistently attempted to regurgitate some of the talking points that I've seen in that video within the last 2 to 3 weeks without thoroughly understanding how misinformed they are.
And I think it was probably talking about, I think, because me personally, I seen the video. I saw Jimmy High Roller. Like, I've been watching Jimmy High Roller since, what, 2017? So I've been watching Jimmy High Roller for a really long time. So it's no doubt that I could have definitely saw that video, and I do remember when that video came out, but I don't remember anything in the video because it's been so long. Like, let me see. This video was posted 4 years ago, and somebody recommended for me to watch it now. So, I mean, yeah.
So today, I'm going to try my hardest to not only correct, but rightfully inform as many people as I possibly can.
Clarification added to prohibit handshaking through rigid enforcement, allowing a defensive player to retain contact with his opponent so long as he does not impede his opponent's progress. So, since 1979, it has been completely illegal to handshake players in the NBA.
Not really. The rule that Jimmy High Roller is referring to was the NBA's first attempt to try to reduce the impact of handshaking in the NBA, but it failed miserably for multiple reasons. For starters, it allowed the defensive player to put their hands on the hip of the offensive player so long as it did not impede their progress. Now, the reason why this rule was such a massive failure is because unless the offensive player was making an obvious or dramatic move from one hand to the next, attempting to switch directions, there's no way that the referees were going to know how much pressure the defensive player was applying with a hand check that could potentially be impeding their progress.
6. and the Knicks 4. And there is the foul on Harper for the hard handshake.
And it was almost like Dirk.
With hand checking, I remember I said a couple videos back that I believe that hand checking wasn't that big of a deal, because of the fact that when you have certain skilled players like a Larry Bird or a skilled player like Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, those guys, it didn't really affect those guys. And when you got players now today who are sizing up, going left to right, bah, 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 it's not going to work then. But then you got people in the comment section saying that it was going to affect the game if they were to implement that today, because it wouldn't allow them to even, go in a bag, go ta, 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 because they got their hand placed on them. So it really goes both ways. There's two sides to that. Me personally, I don't know. I don't know, because like I said, Michael Jordan was not fazed by the hand check, okay? He wasn't. You could put the hand check and you could say, oh, the hand check did affect MJ. He was still scoring 40, so I'm you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, it probably did. Of course, it probably did have some type of impact to the game because it's talked about a lot, so has some type of impact. But certain guys, it just didn't work on. You know what I'm saying? It didn't work on. I don't know.
Was going to see what he could get away with, and Joe Crawford all over it.
It's hard to tell how much resistance he is showing with that hand check.
Barb, you were talking about how much pressure does the...
Now, let me ask y'all this. Is hand checking and holding the same thing? Is hand checking and holding the same thing? The reason why I asked that is because people have considered that as hand checking as well. Where, I've seen different variations. One where they'll place the hand and literally just hold it there while he's trying to do what he's trying to do. Where he's going, when he's, touching, just tapping it. People call that hand checking. Hold on. My bad. I just got a text message. He tapping and stuff like that. And I've seen people straight up take two hands and hold them. And they've called that hand checking. So, is it? I'm just asking because I'm curious. It's not like I'm trying to make a statement or anything.
First of all, you're allowed a light hand check, but not to impede the progress of the dribble.
Okay, so that's the light hand check that I was just talking about, where he's able to, you know what I'm saying?
Matter of the officials putting a little bit more a closer look into the hand check. The rules are intact.
So yeah, the rule that Jimmy High Roller is referring to did not eliminate hand checking, simply because the rule was written way too loosely and it still gave way too much judgment call on the referees, in which, for the most part, referees still allowed players to hand check and potentially even impede the progress of offensive players.
That's holding though. See, that's the part that I'm confused on. Is that hand checking or is it holding? Or are they both the same thing?
When they were trying to make their moves. But more importantly, the real reason why I know for a fact the rule that Jimmy High Roller is referring to did not eliminate hand checking is because before the 1994-1995 season, there is a rule that specifically and exclusively states that you can no longer hand check in the backcourt leading all the way up to the free throw line. So if hand checking was truly eliminated in the NBA, why would they have to write another rule that clearly states that it was eliminated before the 94-95 season?
Would like to see that part of defense taken out in the future of the NBA.
Well, the feeling is the rules will be adjusted come next season because there are several masters at that, and Derek right at the top of the list.
The other rule, of course, no hand checking.
The players have adjusted quite early in the year. Everybody was very concerned about it. They've gone to the forearm, but the players have really adjusted to it, and we hardly see it called anymore.
But unfortunately, even this rule failed miserably in trying to remove the physicality from the offensive and defensive player on the perimeter. As a great Chuck Daly just stated, as soon as they removed hand checking, forearm checking basically became the adaptation of trying to keep perimeter players at bay from attacking the basket.
And this is at this point where I start to see that. Like, I really start to see that. Like, people, I've played all different types of people. I played all different types of players. I've played people who have hand checked, played people who like football, like I'm literally holding you now. and I've played the forearm check, and I've done, well, I haven't held people, like, no, but I've hand checked and I've forearm checked, and I had people that were okay with it, and I had people that weren't okay with it, and and it's definitely something to talk about, because it's like, does it really like completely stop you? Is that the only thing that really stops you? Think about it, because I've done hand checking on people, and I've seen strong people hand check people, and I've seen very skilled players just get through that, just slip up off of that.
Chuck Daly isn't the only coach who talked about this during the 90s as well. Phil Jackson is also on record stating, defenders then started using their forearm in the shoulder area and hip area of the offensive player in effort to reroute the offensive player or to slow them down. But the most important thing that I want to convey was the reasoning behind changing the rules, as Rod Thorne, who at the time was the vice president of basketball operations of the entire NBA, clearly stated, as he was the one who was pushing some of the rule changes. Basically, we were trying to encourage more driving to the basket. Our hopes is that teams will get a few more shot opportunities or draw fouls, whatever the case may be. We like to force some players to develop a mid-range game. Now, the reason why the NBA was so hell-bent in trying to seek out some changes is because it was very clear that certain NBA teams were taking advantage of some of the rules at the time, so much so that the NBA was starting to slow down in pace.
Wait. Last fall, go back. I need to read what he just said. Last fall, the league highlighted 2 areas for enforcement by referees. The league put more, what does that say, honest? I don't know what that word is right here. I don't know what that word is. On defenders to establish position before drawing a charging foul, which led to more blocking calls and more incentive for players to drive to the rim. And the league instructed referees to tighten enforcement of forearm checking by perimeter defenders. Basically, we're trying to encourage more driving to the basket.
Advantages of some of the rules at the time, so much so that the NBA was starting to slow down in pace, which thus means the point total was also starting to go down as well, which eventually meant that the NBA and the product itself was nowhere near as good as it once was. And actually, speaking upon pace, I do have to address this part of Jimmy High Roller's video as well.
The 80s are widely considered to be the most physical era in NBA history. Now, within that decade, teams averaged 109 points per game. In the 1990s, NBA teams averaged 101 points per game, and in the 2000s, NBA teams averaged only 97 points per game.
I'm sorry if I come across a bit too harsh, but quite frankly, I just don't know why Jimmy High Roller was trying to make this argument. Even though, yes, there were rules that were set in place that potentially could have made it a little bit more difficult for some players, especially those on the perimeter, to score, but easily, and everybody should know this, but easily the most influential variable to how many points are being scored on a year-to-year basis is pace. The simple fact that Jimmy High Roller never brought up pace in and of itself makes that argument completely invalid.
Wait, I need to rewind to hear what he just said.
Being scored on a year-to-year, easily the most influential variable. Easily, and everybody should know this, but easily the most influential variable to how many points are being scored on a year-to-year basis is pace. The simple fact that Jimmy High Roller never brought up pace in and of itself makes that argument completely invalid. And if you were to ever look at pace and graph it, you would clearly tell that pace was significantly higher in the 80s and early 90s than it was in the late 90s and practically the entire 2000s.
Nah, that is true. Because when you look at like basketball in the late 90s, the pace was slow. The pace was very slow. And in the 2000s, that's interesting. I thought the pace went up in the 2000s. I thought that, in the 90s, the pace was slower. And in 2000s, it got faster. But really, it's the opposite. Like the late 90s. Yeah, so pace in the 2000s was a lot slower than in the 80s and in the 90s. That's actually really interesting. Pace in the... Wow, that's actually really interesting. I'm sorry.
And what makes things even more eye-opening is that if you were to do the exact same thing for scoring, you would get a very similar graph. So much so that if you will plot them right on top of one another, it's practically the exact same graph. Except for this subsection here that occurred right after 2004, where for whatever reason, the pace really didn't increase that much, but somehow, some way, we saw a huge explosion of scoring. I wonder what that was.
The handshake rule was clarified, redefined, and re-implemented in 2004, and according to most fans, this is when defense lightened up and scoring became exponentially easier.
So first and foremost, let me add some clarification here, because Jimmy High Roller is using terminology as if hand checking was fully eliminated in the NBA, in which it never was. So the rule in which Jimmy High Roller is referring to was to further reduce the impact of hand checking, which is what it clearly states in the screenshot that Jimmy High Roller is providing in his own video, as the term curtail means to further reduce, not implement, not reintroduce, but to further reduce. Furthermore, again, in the own screenshot that Jimmy High Roller decided to utilize in his own video, it clearly states that the set of rules that he is referring to was meant to open up the game. And so when Jimmy High Roller makes these arguments and these statements, it comes across as if he doesn't thoroughly understand the full history and background to the rule changes. So here's an abridged version of what exactly happened during the early and mid 2000s. The NBA was going through a transitional phase, and the league was very concerned of the condition of the product, because the league was starting to slow down again, and with there being a slower pace means there's going to be fewer points to be scored. And potentially because of the fewer points being scored, a lot of people were fearful that the NBA ratings were starting to decline as well because of this. So there needed to be some type of action. And Jerry Colangelo, the great Jerry Colangelo, came to the rescue of David Stern and the NBA and basically told him that as a lifer, as a diehard NBA fan, if he was starting to be turned off by the NBA, then it was going to be a major problem. And David Stern completely agreed with him, thus appointing him to a committee that was set to change the rules. So Jerry Colangelo gathered the committee that consisted of former NBA players and coaches, some of those people being Jack Ramsey, Jerry West, and Rod Thorne, and they got together and they looked at a bunch of footage from previous decades and eras and compared it to where the NBA was at the moment. And in his own words, the NBA had evolved, or better yet, de-evolved to be more accurate, to a place in which it was very obvious that changes needed to be made right away. And with that being stated, this is indeed the committee that decided to remove illegal defense, virtually allowing zone defense, made sure that the time that was given to the offensive player to cross the half-court line was reduced from 10 seconds to 8 seconds, which is why now we have an 8-second backcourt violation. And furthermore, even thought about changing the dimensions of the lane to a trapezoid shape to push out post players further from the basket, thus making it harder for them to post up, and eventually and hopefully giving a little bit more influence to perimeter players, but decided not to do that because in Colangelo's own words, he decided he wanted to keep the identity of the NBA. But now with all of the other rules set in place, 2 or 3 years later, the committee also took a look and taking the next steps in beginning to outlaw all hand checking on the perimeter. So that's exactly what they wanted to do. And again, they wanted to do this so it made it easier for players to drive into the lane, open it up a little bit more. And in the words of Stu Jackson, who was an NBA executive and vice president of basketball operations, who also took part of the committee, as he's been on record as stating, the special committee on the rules anticipated when we implemented the package back in 2001 that fundamentally it would change the game. Collectively, all 3 of those rules allowed the game to breathe. So with that being said, this is not some conspiracy theory. This is not my opinion. This is not some ex-NBA players hating. This is what the people who were setting the rules were claiming as they were making the rules themselves, because they wanted to open up the game and make it fundamentally easier for perimeter players to attack the basket and more freedom of movement. And because of all of the rule changes, certain teams such as the mid-2000 Phoenix Suns started to emerge as optimism continued to grow amongst organizations like the Suns, and they started to recognize that players such as Steve Nash was in the right place at the right time, and they were able to take advantage of the elimination of perimeter hand checking in the 2002 NBA rule changes that Jerry Colangelo spearheaded to restore the tempo and the improvisation in the NBA. And as I bring up the Phoenix Suns and Steve Nash, here's a quick side note. The biggest reason why many people make arguments that Steve Nash benefited from the system that he played in as well as the rule changes is because he indeed did. It's not people hating, it's a fact. Jerry Colangelo, again the man who was the head of the committee that was changing the rules, at the same time was the president of the Phoenix Suns. I don't know why David Stern allowed that to happen, but for whatever reason he did. And there's multiple articles about how Jerry Colangelo's involvement on both sides of the aisle heavily influenced how they built that team in the mid-2000s. But if you don't want to believe me, and if you don't want to believe all these other articles, here's David Griffin before he was a GM for the Cleveland Cavaliers, as he was a vice president for the Phoenix Suns and a staffer for the organization for nearly 2 decades, and him flat out claiming how they had a massive advantage due to the involvement of Jerry Colangelo. We had a built-in advantage because Jerry Colangelo was a chairman of the board.
Okay, maybe I might have missed this, but I'm trying to figure out, so was hand checking completely taken out of the game, like removed, or was it just reduced? Because I'm still stuck on that. Maybe I might have missed that. But I'm just trying to figure that out. And then another thing that I also noticed about 90s defenses is that 90s defense was very cluttered. Like, you watch how the offense was. There might be, 2 people at the top, 2 people in the corner, or 2 people at the top, 1 person in the corner, and then 2 people in the paint or something like that. But the defense will all be packed in the paint. They will all be packed in the inside of the 3-point line, but in the paint. So it was very cluttered. And I think that's because of the post play and stuff like that. There was more post players in the 90s. But when you compare that to now, everybody can shoot. All 5 guys can shoot. So they're all outside the 3-point line. There's so much space, and there's way more room to do what you want to do. That's another thing about, the defense. Like, if you look at it, the defense was very cluttered in the 80s and in the 90s. And now the defense is like, it's not really as cluttered as it used to be.
Knew from the very beginning what was likely to come about, so we were able to plan for longer than everybody else. If you told Daryl Morey right now that 3 years from now the cap is going to be a number that only he knows, Houston is going to have a pretty big advantage. We were able to build a team that's pretty ahead of the curve. So that's not me making the claim. That's not some ex-NBA player making the claim. That's not some random blogger making the claim either. That's somebody who was involved with the construction of a team that heavily benefited from the rules changing in the mid-2000s. So when you hear ex-NBA players, including those who played along Steve Nash, make claims such as this.
I played with him along with Shaq, and I think there's and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's this feeling that Nash really took off and became MVP caliber once the rules kind of changed. Mm-hmm. And, before that, there was a physicality to the game. And once they took the physicality out, at 31, 32, he had his best years, which you really don't hear of.
They're not making it up. They're speaking from experience. They know what they're talking about, and they understand what was happening in the mid-2000s to attempt to make it easier for perimeter players to score. But for whatever reason, I know for a fact people are going to try to bring this up as well.
What about players that played before and after the hand check rule? If fans are right about this rule, then these players that played before and after the hand check rule should have seen a significant increase in offensive output after the rule came into effect.
Some of them did, I think, right? I think some of them did.
Out of the 21 All-Stars that season, 18 of them had a higher points per game average when handshaking was allowed, and only 3 players had a higher points per game average after
Okay, so
handshaking rule was established.
okay, so some of these are lacking context though. Like Shaq was getting older. Shaq was just getting older. Gary Payton was getting older. Who else was getting older? Some of these people, they were just getting older. Kobe was the first person that came to mind that I was like, yeah, definitely got better. And I think Tracy McGrady was dealing with injuries. Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, this part of the video was so poorly researched that it blew my mind, and it actually is the driving force of me making this video. Now, for those out there who don't thoroughly understand why this is so poorly researched, let me give you an example. What Jimmy High Roller just did was take a player such as Gary Payton and looked at every year that Gary Payton played in the NBA before the 2004-2005 season, and took the average and came to the conclusion that Gary Payton averaged 18 points before the rule change. The problem with this though is that when he looked at the years of Gary Payton after the rule change, he's literally only using the last 3 years of Gary Payton's career, which in and of itself is extremely problematic. But when you start to take into consideration,
literally because Garrett, like I said, some of these players were getting older. It's lacking context.
that he did that for all of the players, it becomes very clear that, again, this was poorly executed. And also, like I said before, the rules that were set in place, it was meant to make it easier for perimeter players to attack the basket and to get easier looks. Not easier for post players such as Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and certainly not Ben Wallace. So I'm going to help Jimmy High Roller out here for a second because, again, he did a poor job of trying to execute this type of researching. So what he should have done is this. A, exclude the researching to only perimeter-oriented players. The second thing that he should have done is only exclude it to players who were in their prime when the rule changes were being implemented, and only utilizing a set amount of years before the rule changes and a set amount of years after the rule changes. So he's not utilizing the latter part of Vince Carter's career when he's playing for the Atlanta Hawks.
That's what I'm saying, because he was dealing with injuries around that time, wasn't he?
Concert with all of the other years he played prior to this season. And finally, he should have utilized some efficiency numbers as well, because again, for the most part, the pace really didn't change that much. So more or less, you're not going to see any massive amount of jump in scoring, because again, there's only so many possessions to be had on a game-to-game basis. And if he did that, he would have clearly seen that the star caliber perimeter players saw some type of increase in their points, efficiency, if not both. And finally, we have illegal defense. And quite frankly, I'm gonna be honest with you all, I don't know what illegal defense is.
I was just about to say that. I was like, what is illegal defense?
Read multiple articles and as much information as I possibly can upon the defensive system, but every single time I watch footage, I see multiple players just sagging off of their assignment. I see big men just hanging around the lane.
Oh, I see where he's going at. So that's where, like, back then where you couldn't play zone, like you can either stick to your man or you double team him or something like that. I think that's what that illegal defense was.
And quite frankly, even though, yes, you either had to defend your man or commit to a double team, I see a lot of teams committing to a double team, knowing that the opponent doesn't really have any offensive players who can properly space out the floor. And when I thought about the spacing, that's when it hit me. Now, this is my opinion, but I do have a lot of facts to back this up. The reason why scoring was so difficult in the 80s and 90s and even in the 2000s in comparisons to where we are in today's league isn't just because of the physicality and hand checking, it's also due to the lack of floor spacing. But the one thing that really makes me cringe is when I hear people make arguments like this.
If Giannis Antetokounmpo played in the 90s, all the Bucks would have to do is clear out on the weak side and allow Giannis to abuse his defender and race at the basket.
Now, I promise you I'm not trying to be that condescending, but seriously, do you not watch the NBA? Listen to what he just said again.
If Giannis Antetokounmpo played in the 90s, all the Bucks would have to do is clear out on the weak side and allow Giannis to abuse his defender and race at the basket.
Wait a minute. Didn't they do that in the 90s? Literally, didn't they do that in the 90s?
Defensive players would be forced to follow their man outside.
I need to hear what Lo is trying to say, because that's literally what they used to do in the 90s.
Far away to help, even if the player they're guarding isn't an outside threat. The only other option is to double team Giannis and, again, leave your man completely open.
So again, I have to ask, do you even watch the NBA? Because if you did watch the NBA, you would clearly tell that that's exactly what teams do in today's game. Quite frankly, the Houston Rockets have basically done heavy isolation for the last 2 to 3 years now with James Harden, mainly because of the amount of spacing that they have on their roster. And granted, in today's NBA, you can technically play zone defense, but due to how prevalent spacing is in today's league, no team runs a zone on any type of consistent basis.
Yeah, that is true. I've seen interviews of a lot of players saying that, like, it's easier to score in the NBA than it is in like college, even, because in college they are running zone, but when you get to the NBA, it's almost all 1v1 and just man to man.
In fact, most teams are forced to play man on man because, again, there's so many sharpshooters at every position. And because of the amount of three-point threats that are constantly on the floor, it has forced teams to play defense very similar to how we see executed in the 90s with the illegal defensive rules. And so with all that being said, I do want to leave you on this note. For starters, did hand checking exist? Yes, it did. The NBA attempted to abolish it multiple times, but failed miserably due to how loosely the rules were written. But now when it comes to my own personal opinion on hand checking, I think it's completely overrated because majority of teams in the 80s and 90s were established offensively with an interior presence, not through the perimeter. So when I hear players like...
But okay, when you say that, let me let him finish.
Kenny Smith talk about, oh, I was hand checked all the time and players in today's game couldn't stand to be hand checked. I laugh because Kenny Smith was on teams where there was more so of an interior presence than there was on a perimeter. So quite frankly, Kenny Smith wasn't the first nor second option on his teams.
Wait. So what about the players who were playing at the perimeter? There was teams, well, the only team that I can think of right now, actually, yeah, wasn't the Pistons. The Pistons had paint presence, but they weren't paint oriented. They weren't just like, they were like, we're gonna put our offense strictly to the paint. They had Joe Dumars, Isaiah Thomas was scoring. Who else was on that team? Man, only two players I can think of is Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars. And then of course you got the Chicago Bulls, but it was just MJ at one point. And that was a perimeter play, and the thing about it is that was the Bulls' biggest issue, was the interior presence. They didn't have it. They always had Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. Those are two perimeter people. Now you can say you got the Horace Grants and the Tony Kukoc and the Bill Wellingtons and the Bill Cartwright and those guys, but these guys are not going against. They're not gonna be great against a Hakeem or a Shaq or a Charles Barkley or a come on David Robinson or I could keep going, but you know what I'm talking about. So I mean, there was teams that still were able to do what they do. Now the point that I'm trying to make is that, like I said, like the hand checking, I don't think the hand checking was that big, man. I really don't think it was that big of a deal. I don't really think that was that big of a deal.
Now, second, when it comes to illegal defense, did teams benefit from illegal defense in the 80s and 90s? Yes, they did, especially in the late 90s when they changed the rules again that made illegal defense even stricter. However, when people talk about zone defense and how 90s players can't play in today's NBA, again, I laugh at that because it's very clear that you don't thoroughly understand either how illegal defense works or you don't watch basketball in today's game, because due to the abundance of spacing in today's league, makes it significantly easier for isolation players to play, regardless of what era in which you're comparing them to. But when it comes to my own personal opinion about zone defense and illegal defense, quite frankly, this is the biggest reason why I believe the 2000s was the most difficult era to score in. Because you had zone defense and they didn't completely eliminate hand checking, or at least didn't try again to completely eliminate hand checking until the mid 2000s. And then also they didn't even start calling defensive 3 seconds until the mid 2000s as well. So you had a whole bunch of teams like the Pistons, the Spurs, the Indiana Pacers in the early 2000s, who defensively were extremely dominant in holding their opponent to low scoring numbers, record low scoring numbers, which again made it harder for offensive players to score, which is why, in my opinion, the 2000s were the most difficult era to score in. But outside of my opinions, everything else that I say in this video is irrefutable fact. I put as much information I can in the description below, so if you want to challenge me, you can, but more than likely you're going to lose in that department. And the only reason why I'm not going hard on Jimmy High Roller the same way that I would go hard on someone like Colin Cowherd is because I was at a point where Jimmy High Roller is at right now, where you go on YouTube and you search up all these videos and there's this avalanche of new information that you have to receive. And unfortunately, Jimmy High Roller just didn't do his due diligence to actually weed out a lot of the lies. And again, to be quite frank with you all, I've been caught up in that as well, and unfortunately regurgitated some of those same talking points on this channel as well. And so, since this type of video is well overdue, I just decided to just take the opportunity and properly inform as much as I possibly can to my audience, and hopefully correcting some of the misinformation that was spreaded through that video. But again, no hard feelings. And with all that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. If you made it this far, kudos to you.
Well, my thing about it is like the 90s defense, it was definitely really physical. I will say that 80s and 90s defense was definitely physical. But I've always said this. I said the greatest balance of defense and offense was the 2000s. The greatest balance. I'm not saying that the 2000s was better than the 90s or the 80s. I'm saying that the balance, because I see what the NBA was trying to do. I obviously saw that, and I was right. The NBA was trying to implement a more offensive approach to the game, and as you can see, they tried to do that. So in conclusion, I can see that they did not completely take away hand checking. They just tried to reduce it multiple times, and they failed. Like they failed. But let me know what y'all think in the comment section, man. I know this was a long video, so if you stayed this long, man, I appreciate you a whole lot. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.